Welcome to Catastrophes. This is a podcast about disasters. Today, we are discussing the Spanish blackouts, which also affected France and Portugal. Today, we're going to look into why the blackouts occurred, some potential answers. While it's inconclusive yet, we can kind of speculate on a few things. And then we're going to look at the direct impacts and the secondary kind of impacts that really nobody's considering. And then a larger discussion about how we have, as a society, become so reliant on power, technology, and so on. So the intent of today is not to demean or diminish the experiences of any people who have faced an event like this, but rather explore, question, critique, and ask why something like this has happened. So with that, let's begin. Welcome back. Today, discussing the Spanish blackouts, which occurred on April 28th. Today, it is Thursday, May 1st, and we are going to get into some of the proposed reasons why this event might have happened, and then some of the direct, the indirect effects, and then we're going to just have a short discussion on kind of the overall implications of being so reliant on electricity. To begin, let's talk about the background. How does something like this happen? So while there's ongoing investigations, I think it's relevant and probably likely that we can pick out a few of the reasons. When something this large happens, a total full-scale power failure occurs, there's oftentimes more than one or two or three reasons. So a little bit of the information I'm going to provide is somewhat speculative. It's supported by a few professors out of university. One of them is the University of Lyon in Spain. Another, I believe, is out of Madrid. So we have a few answers and why something like this might have happened, but we don't know the primary reason yet. But as a whole, the background, the full power outage, which hit roughly 50 million people, according to some sources, across France, southern France, Portugal, and then a majority of Spain. The power outage started anywhere between 12:30 to 12:55 across all of those places, and it took 23 hours for the system to come back on and be declared normal or back to normal, running again. So 23 hours without any electricity. Lots of implications for that. But again, talking about why. One of the first reasons that we will cover is by Dr. Carlos Hida, and he has some really interesting points surrounding not only renewable energy, fossil fuels, and nuclear power, and how the supply may have been one of the factors that caused a disruption. So it's really interesting. Spain draws not only renewables, but also fossil fuels and nuclear power. And over the next few years, Spain is kind of pulling out of the nuclear game, and they're going to have more reliance on the renewable sources along with fossil fuels. What's really interesting is the idea, and he talks about it in an article in the conversation, you can read it. Spain is not only trying to they are shutting down their nuclear plants, but they're also trying to go more towards the renewable solutions. And his point is that the use of renewables, while it's really good, it has good long-term benefits, it's clean, it's environmentally friendly, there is almost zero maintenance, so it's really cost effective. It can have actually a big strain on the power supply and the energy grid itself. And there's a second article I think he wrote as well, or maybe somebody else, and it really talks about the idea of consistent electricity from renewable sources. So if we think of a wind farm where giant wind turbines will produce electricity and energy because of wind. Those are what we call variable renewable sources, where it isn't always windy. So on days where there's no wind or less wind, you're not getting the same amount of power to the power grid. And then similarly, when there's a lot of wind, you are getting additional. So the energy grid itself, the systems, the infrastructure has to be adaptable and being able to take both of those on. Whereas when we consider firm renewables, They are more so related to consistency within the amount of electricity that is being produced. So Dr. Hida, he states, well, there might actually be a little bit of a destabilization of the system if there's too much of an up and down. And this is really interesting because, again, Spain is opting out of nuclear and they're trying to use more wind and solar facilities as they continue to use more and adapt their grids and their systems to these new sources and really integrate them more. Some officials have stated that the current grid is not prepared for them, largely because of the wide range of electricity that gets distributed from those renewable sources to the electrical grid. If it's too wide of array, the grid itself may not be able to actually contain all the electricity, or not enough of the electricity, which is a really interesting and difficult problem because you want to use more renewables, but you have to be able to have the capacity to use them. So a really interesting problem, and I think he articulates it well. He's not saying that we need to totally shift away from renewables. He actually says, as we continue, we need to be more thoughtful about the amount of power we use. But then also some of the new technologies that we have, artificial intelligence, for instance, is drawing more power than ever before. And I think this is kind of a problem that many countries around the world are facing, that there is more electricity use. And there is oftentimes older grids, older critical infrastructure that is just not intended to, one, have a wide range of input from the power that it is receiving, but then also the output, the amount of the amount of energy and power we've been using, electricity we've been using, is increasing, and it is also in flux. So I think that's a reasonable answer why this could have happened, but there's a few other reasons, and I think they're worth going into. I first should say I don't have any evidence to suggest that it was a cyber attack or anything like that. Cyber attacks have always been one of the worries related to a lot of power grids and energy systems around the world, largely because there is a digital component to most critical infrastructure that maintains electricity. And this is something between Canada and the US that we actually see, which we call SCADA, and it is our electricity grids. Canada and the US, sorry to go off topic, they have connecting electrical grids, meaning if power went out in northeast Canada, power would likely also go out in the northeast US, largely because the grids are connected. So if there was ever to be a cyber attack and it would hit one of the grids, Canada's or the US's, it would likely affect both countries. So not to rule out cyber attack, there's no evidence to suggest that happened. More so evidence to show that there might have been, just a variation in temperature. Maybe a transformer was broken. Perhaps the phasing out of nuclear. Perhaps there was drops in the amount of electricity which caused this power outage. Again, somewhat speculative. That's all I really was able to find. But really I want to discuss a little bit of a different angle. And that's the question of why did it take 23 hours to flip the power switch back on effectively? And oftentimes for the decision makers, they are really tasked with who needs to get electricity first, and then how do we phase the electricity back in? And these are two dilemmas which require a little bit of a discussion on both. So let's talk about the first part. Who gets electricity first? It's pretty simple, I guess you could say. It's oftentimes the critical infrastructures, the hospitals that need the electricity before, commercial and residential buildings. When we think of the amount of people that go to hospitals day to day, the amount of people that are in emergency responses, the amount of people that require the hospitals to get surgery or in an emergency situation, the criticality of having electricity for hospitals is really, really important. Most hospitals within Canada, within the US, within Spain, France, Portugal, they have backup systems or electricity power grids within the hospitals that will keep the electricity running for a short amount of time. Every hospital is a little bit different, but they do have the capacity to draw on some form of power, but it won't always last the whole day. This lasted for 23 hours. Who's to say if every single hospital was able to do that? But it's one of those things where when we think about who gets power first, we are going back to the hospitals because they're the ones who need it. Life safety, or the people, civilians who are going through an emergency, are always our first priority when we're thinking about any sort of disaster response. And with a large scale power outage like this would be considered a large disaster that's really widespread. So really interesting. The hospitals are always going to be the first ones. And then the critical infrastructures. So our water systems, our heating systems, our air conditioning for larger buildings. The air conditioning point, we'll actually park and talk about that in a bit. But when we think about who gets electricity, we always go large services, hospitals, and then we then filter it a little bit down so that everybody in residential and then commercial gets it. And over the course of 23 hours, we actually see this play out. And there's actually quite a good amount of information to suggest that they played it exactly as expected. Hospitals were first, then other critical services, which maintain most municipalities and cities, but they did it over a specific amount of time. So it's really interesting. If you think about all the power that was lost, it was a lot of it, and I'm not really able to quantify it in a way that's understandable. But you think about all this excess power that they were able to get back if they, quote unquote, turn the switch back on. It might have been too much for the power grid to kind of recoup within the span of a couple minutes. So there's lots of reports suggesting that they phased it. In the second and third hour, they were able to get electricity back in some areas, probably hospitals first, and then there are other critical services. And then in 6 hours after, more critical infrastructure was able to get power. And then 9 hours after, we were able to see residents and buildings and other places get the power back on. So they started to phase the electricity back in. And there is one report from the University of Lyon, and again, I wasn't able to see who said this, but they actually said the electricity grid is unable to balance such a sharp drop between generation and demand. So it has to protect itself automatically. And what that means is you have to reconnect it. There has to be basically a reconnection manually. And it does that. The grid does that. So it doesn't, overwhelm itself and then have more damage. This blackout is interesting because it's clearly, maybe there was some damage to some of the critical infrastructure for the electricity, but we were able to fix that within the span of 23 hours. And anything that was fully damaged, there's other electrical grids that might have been able to help. So because you can't flip the switch back on for everything, you have to phase it. And I think that's a really interesting element within this disaster, which is effectively what it was, because it was so widespread and it hit so many people. So those are, I guess, some of the speculative points, but also some of the points we were able to actually find. Just kind of recapping the background and then how the power was turned back on, quote unquote. Some speculation over input of electricity. The renewable sources for wind, solar might not be as consistent. And so with that, if there's wider arrays, the electrical grid may lose power for some, and then it might have to completely shut off because it can't regenerate all of the demand that is required. A really interesting conundrum for some points. We still don't know the official cause. Whereas, other points suggesting that sometimes there's just too much demand needed, and that in a space, in a age where there is a growing use of artificial intelligence, where more people are using electricity, the demand for electricity is greater because of all of our technology. Perhaps there was just a strain on the electrical grids themselves. And then when we think about the rephasing, the turning back on of the switch, it has to be done in segments, basically. first step here, second step here, and then be targeted about the specific priorities, hospitals first and other strategic infrastructure. So what about the effects? I think it's a really good question, and I want to break it into the direct effects and the indirect effects. And I really think there's several populations we can talk about, but I'll keep it brief. When we think about the direct effects, power is off. So what are the services that require power? We already talked about one, hospitals. Those living with under medical strain or in an emergency care likely do need some form of electricity. Many hospitals do have that backup power grid, but again, they get the priority because of life safety. So, this is one of the most talked about points in the media. You can find a lot more information about it, but our hospitals and people living with a medical condition, long-term care facilities where there's seniors, they are often the ones with the greatest strain when there is no power. And what's interesting is many of the municipalities in the cities within Spain, southern France, and Portugal, it was hot out. 28 degrees, 29 degrees, 25 degrees in some places. So you need air conditioning. And that also might have fed into, again, the reason why power went out in the first place, too much strain. But when we see heat-related illnesses, deaths, it's because there is not access to sheltered areas or air conditioning, and people get heat stroke and they might be isolated. So by all accounts, we don't know if there's any injuries or fatalities from this 23-hour event. But it would be really interesting to see how the culture of Spain and kind of a lot of the walkability within their cities and the knowing your neighbor really played a role in reducing some of those effects. But again, I'm unable to find a lot of those statistics. So for the direct effects, really, we just think about the loss of power for a lot of our day-to-day jobs and everything like that. If you can't use your computer, you might not be able to work. If you need to use online banking, you don't have access to banking. So those were a few of the issues that I did hear. Some other issues are trains were stopped. Airports were really not functioning as well. There's a lot of delays. Traffic lights were not working. So people were asked to stay off the street so that if there was a critical issue, somebody could call 911 and then they could be dispatched. And again, ensuring that the hospitals are running. So just some of the direct effects. But really, I wanted to take a minute to discuss the indirect effects. And for some of the populations, you actually see a lot of the media highlight the good that came out of this. In Barcelona, many people were outside for 5 or 6 hours and they were playing without any cell phones or out anything because they didn't have any cell service or they didn't have access to their Wi-Fi. So for many people, they were able to overcome this. And I think the media did a good job of covering this. And I think there is something to be learned. There is a good lesson to be learned of populations that have that capacity are still able to, not have this reliance on technology. They're able to go outside and make the best of it. In Barcelona, they have been credited as one of the places where they have many facilities for heat-related events. So when it gets plus 25 during the day and plus 15 at night, a heat, a hot day basically, a heat alert, Barcelona is one of the better places to be because there's always a place to go and get cool. So that certainly would have played a role in this for Barcelona, and probably that media speculation is those centers probably opened and allowed people to come in and drop by and stay cool because it was still hot. But also kind of get together as a community. There's many photos and it's all really good. But the groups that aren't really discussed is really interesting. So we think about people living in isolation, people who don't have access to consistent air conditioning, seniors, people who don't have access to a large social group. They might have been vulnerable. And again, because of the weather, because of the 23-hour power outage, if they didn't have the power and the necessary things that they need, it could have been a huge problem. And it's really interesting to see an event like this where, upwards to 55 million people are affected, and those groups, how they respond and react. So by all accounts, the country of Spain did a relatively good job of ensuring their citizens were safe, but also that they had things to do in lieu of not having power in their electrical grids. So really interesting. But overall, and that's the direct, and kind of the indirect effects is, what does this do for people living in vulnerable conditions that do require air conditioning to stay cool and to, basically stay alive. A really interesting kind of line of discussion and thinking. But really where I want to end off this discussion is our over-reliance, or I guess reliance, on electricity as a world. We have adapted a lot of our systems, a lot of our work, a lot of our ability to listen to each other, to connect with each other via technology. We use the internet for everything. We use the internet, to listen to this podcast. And so it's really interesting to see that if an event of this scale can really knock out a lot of our infrastructure for 23 hours and some of the large economic loss that Spain went through, what does a week-long power outage look like? Or a month-long? Or even a year-long? Yeah, interesting things, I think, to think about. What happens if there is something worse and we do only have power for a limited time? What about the hospitals? What about the people who are in need of the critical electricity and the services like that? So that's all I got for today. I really thought that was somewhat of an interesting event. I'm hoping to review some of the things that have actually went well in the last month. And I have several articles. 3 of them are initiatives that have seemed to yield some positive results. One of them is Afloat in Gardens. Another one is something out of Mongolia. So I'm hoping to bring you that over the next month and a half, along with keeping up to date with what's going on around the world. And thank you for listening. I appreciate everybody listening. If you could like and subscribe on YouTube, if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast and Spotify, I would really appreciate that. And thank you all for today.